Detective Marcus Kane had always prided himself on his toughness. He'd risen through the ranks of the precinct with a no-nonsense attitude, often making enemies along the way. But he didn't mind. It came with the job. He had a reputation: ruthless, unyielding, and quick to confront anyone who dared challenge his authority. To him, the world was simple. You earned respect by making people fear you. It was a quiet afternoon in the precinct, the kind of day when everything seems to fall into a routine and people are just going through the motions. Marcus had been working late on a cold case, his mind spinning with dead ends and frustrating leads. The investigation was stalled, and the pressure to close it was mounting. His superior officers were breathing down his neck, demanding results, but all Marcus had were vague leads that didn't lead anywhere. He slammed his fist down on his desk, frustration building. With his jaw clenched, he decided to take a break. He needed to clear his head. As he made his way out of the bullpen, the sound of footsteps behind him made him glance over his shoulder. He didn't recognize the woman who was walking toward him. She was too well dressed for someone who wasn't a senior officer. She was tall and composed, dressed in a sharp black suit that seemed to almost command attention. Her skin was a smooth, deep brown, and her hair was pulled back into a tight bun. Her demeanor was cold, but not in the way of someone who was unfriendly. It was the kind of cold that came from years of professional experience, someone who had seen and done it all without batting an eye. Marcus didn't recognize her face, but there was something about her that made his instincts flare. He didn't like it. "Can I help you?" Marcus asked, his tone flat and dismissive. He had no patience for anyone who wasn't part of his team or someone he could use to get ahead. She stopped in front of him, the air between them thick with an unspoken tension, her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that was hard to ignore. "I was looking for Detective Kane," she said, her voice smooth but firm. There was something about her, something sharp and unyielding that unsettled Marcus. "You found him," he said, narrowing his eyes. "What's this about?" Her lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I've heard a lot about you, Detective Kane," she said, her voice never wavering. "I'm Jasmine Williams." The name didn't immediately register with him, but the confidence in her tone and the way she carried herself made it clear she wasn't just some random officer. She was someone important. "Jasmine Williams?" Marcus repeated, trying to place the name. Still nothing came to mind. "I'm the head of internal affairs," she replied, her gaze never leaving his. Internal affairs. The realization hit Marcus like a ton of bricks. Internal Affairs was the department that investigated corruption, misconduct, and unethical behavior within the force. Jasmine Williams, the woman standing before him, was someone whose job it was to hold officers accountable for their actions. She was not someone you wanted to cross, especially if you had a history of bending or breaking the rules. But Marcus was used to being in control. He didn't care about the rules as long as they didn't interfere with his goals. He had been known to skirt the line when necessary, maybe even step over it, but he had always gotten away with it. No one had ever challenged him like this before. Jasmine didn't flinch as Marcus took a step closer to her, his shoulders squared. The tension between them was palpable, like the calm before a storm. "I don't have time for games," Marcus muttered, trying to regain control of the situation. "If you're here to lecture me or make some kind of report, save it." Jasmine's eyes flickered for a moment, but she remained unfazed. Without warning, she stepped closer to him. Marcus, caught off guard, took a step back but tried to keep his composure. "Let's make one thing clear," Jasmine said, her voice low and steady. "I don't play games, but you—" She stopped herself, her gaze hardening. "You crossed a line." Marcus's brow furrowed. What was she talking about? He had barely exchanged a few words with her, yet she was acting as if he had already done something unforgivable. Before he could say anything, she raised her hand and slapped him across the face. The sound echoed through the empty hallway like a gunshot, and Marcus stood there, stunned, unable to move. His cheek burned, and for the first time in years, he didn't know how to react. Jasmine looked at him, her face unwavering, her eyes cold and calculated. "You just made a huge mistake," she said, her voice calm, yet filled with an underlying fury. Marcus stood there, his hands still frozen in the air, not sure whether to retaliate or try to apologize, but nothing he could say would change what had just happened. As he stared at her, stunned and angry, Jasmine didn't flinch. Her eyes were locked on his, and for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt like he was the one being judged. The sense of control he had always held over others was slipping away, and he wasn't sure how to regain it. "You'll find out soon enough who I am," Jasmine said, her voice low, before she turned and walked away. Marcus stood there, his hands still on his cheek, unable to move. He had no idea who she really was, or how much trouble he had just gotten himself into. Marcus stood there for a long moment, his mind racing as he processed what had just happened. The sting of the slap was still sharp on his cheek, but it was the weight of the situation that began to settle in. Jasmine Williams, the woman who had just slapped him, wasn't just some random officer. She had identified herself as the head of internal affairs, a position so powerful it sent a cold shiver down his spine. He rubbed his cheek, absently, still reeling from the shock of it all. He had been slapped by a woman, yes, but more than that, it was the realization of who she was that rattled him. Internal Affairs was the department that oversaw the very officers who were meant to uphold the law. They were the ones who investigated corruption, misconduct, and any behavior that stained the badge. Jasmine wasn't just an officer. She was a gatekeeper, someone who could expose everything he had done in his career with a single report. If she wanted, she could bring him down, destroy his career, his reputation, his life. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest as he stood there in the hallway, his hands still pressed to his cheek. He didn't know what to do next. He was angry, furious even. But there was also a part of him that was deeply unsettled. He had always been in control of his world, never once considering the possibility that someone could challenge him and come out on top. But Jasmine had done just that. His thoughts spun out of control as he turned to watch her walk away, her heels clicking with each measured step. He wanted to yell at her, to demand an explanation, but he knew that wouldn't get him anywhere. He had just slapped her in anger, but she had shown no fear. It was as if she had been expecting it. And now, with the realization of who she was, it felt like he had made the most catastrophic mistake of his life. Jasmine disappeared around the corner, leaving Marcus standing alone, feeling the weight of his actions. He knew he needed to regain control. He couldn't let her walk away thinking she had won. But the truth was, in that brief exchange, she already had. And he didn't know how to fix it. Minutes passed before he managed to shake himself out of his daze. He returned to his desk, but his thoughts were scattered. He tried to focus on the case file in front of him, but it was no use. His mind kept drifting back to Jasmine, her calm demeanor, her unwavering confidence, the look in her eyes as she stood there, confronting him with an authority he hadn't been prepared for. The next few hours dragged on, but Marcus couldn't shake the image of her from his mind. Every time he glanced at his phone, every time the door to his office creaked open, he half expected her to walk in, ready to pull the trigger on his career. He wasn't afraid, at least not in the way most would expect. Marcus had always lived on the edge, willing to take risks, to cut corners, to play dirty if it meant getting ahead. But this was different. Jasmine wasn't like anyone he had ever encountered. She wasn't easily intimidated, and she wasn't afraid to use her power. And that made her dangerous. Marcus tried to ignore the gnawing feeling in the pit of his stomach, but it lingered, growing stronger as the day wore on. By the time the sun began to set, he had come to one grim realization. This wasn't going to go away. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Jasmine wasn't just some angry officer with a vendetta. She had the means to destroy him. She had the resources, the connections, and the authority to investigate every dark corner of his career, to expose every unethical decision he had ever made. The thought of his career crumbling, of his name becoming a cautionary tale whispered in the halls of the precinct, made his stomach churn. But it wasn't just his career at stake. He had spent years building his reputation, cultivating the image of a tough, no-nonsense detective who got results at any cost. If Jasmine had her way, that reputation would be shattered. He couldn't let that happen. Marcus leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as his mind raced with possibilities. He could try to smooth things over, maybe apologize. though it galled him to even think of it. He could try to discredit her, paint her as an overzealous bureaucrat who had no place making waves in the department. But the more he thought about it, the less likely those options seemed. Jasmine had a presence about her, an aura of authority that couldn't be easily undermined. And from what little he had learned about her in their brief exchange, she wasn't someone who would be easily intimidated. No, if Marcus was going to get out of this, he would have to play a different game. He would need to find something to leverage, something to hold over her head. There had to be a weakness, something in her past, something hidden that could be used as a bargaining chip. But even as he thought of it, Marcus knew that it was a dangerous path to walk. He wasn't sure how far he was willing to go to protect himself, to protect his career. He had made a mistake, and now it was time to figure out just how deep the consequences would run. The next day, Marcus found himself pacing in his office, his mind racing with a plan. He would need to keep his cool, gather as much information as he could, and figure out how to stay one step ahead of Jasmine. He had been in tough situations before, but nothing like this. The stakes were higher now than they had ever been, and he couldn't afford to lose. Not now. Not ever. Jasmine Williams had made her move. Now it was his turn. Marcus sat at his desk, staring blankly at the cold case file in front of him. His fingers tapped rhythmically on the desk, but his mind wasn't focused on the investigation. No, his thoughts kept circling back to Jasmine Williams, the head of internal affairs. He couldn't get the image of her out of his head. How calm and composed she had been, how effortlessly she had placed him in his place with a single slap, and how little she seemed to care about his anger or his rank. It was a reality check, one he wasn't quite sure how to handle. He hadn't heard from her since their brief encounter in the hallway, but he knew that wouldn't last. Jasmine was a woman of action. Her job was to investigate corruption, and he had just handed her an open invitation to probe into his life and his work. In a single, brief interaction, she had turned the tables on him, and now he was left trying to piece together how to regain control. The phone on his desk buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. He picked it up quickly, hoping it was a distraction from the uncomfortable silence hanging in the air. "Detective Kane," he said curtly, not bothering with pleasantries. "Marcus, it's Daryl," came the voice on the other end. "We need you in the field. There's a lead we need you to follow up on." It was a welcome distraction. For the first time in hours, Marcus felt a brief flicker of relief. Work. Something tangible. Something he could control. He quickly stood up, grabbing his jacket. "On my way," he muttered before hanging up the phone. He had barely stepped into the parking lot when he heard a voice behind him. His gut tightened. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "Detective Kane." Jasmine's voice was like ice. It sent a chill down his spine, and he froze in place. He turned slowly, meeting her gaze. She was standing by her car, arms crossed, her eyes locked on his with an unblinking intensity. There was no warmth, no friendliness, just the cool, calculated stare of someone who had the power to control the situation. "Jasmine," Marcus said, his voice betraying the uncertainty he felt. He knew he had to play this carefully. He couldn't afford to antagonize her any further. Not yet. She tilted her head slightly, studying him as if trying to gauge his next move. "I was hoping we could talk," she said, her tone professional, but there was an edge to it that made Marcus's stomach churn. "What about?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Jasmine stepped closer, her heels clicking with each step. "What happened yesterday?" she said simply, her voice still cool, but now with a firmness that made his chest tighten. "You slapped me, detective, and I need to understand why." Marcus bristled at the way she said it. There was no anger, no attempt to provoke him. She was simply stating the facts, and that was what unnerved him the most. She wasn't reacting like most people would. Most people, if slapped, would shout, retaliate, or at the very least show some sign of offense, but not Jasmine. She wasn't reacting at all, at least not in the way he expected. "I was angry," Marcus said, the words feeling hollow even as they left his mouth. "I shouldn't have done it." Jasmine nodded, her gaze never leaving his. "No, you shouldn't have." Her words were sharp, cutting through the tension in the air like a blade. He swallowed hard, looking away from her for a moment. "I didn't mean—" "Don't make excuses," Jasmine interrupted him, her voice firm. I'm not interested in your apologies. I'm interested in understanding what you were thinking when you did it. Marcus opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. What was he thinking? He wasn't sure. Anger. Frustration. He had been so accustomed to being in control of every situation, of everyone around him, that when she stood there, unfazed by his outburst, it pushed him to lash out. And when he slapped her, he had thought it would have some kind of impact on her, but it didn't. Instead, it had only exposed his own vulnerabilities. I don't know what you want from me, he muttered, trying to salvage the conversation, but feeling the tension between them rise. Jasmine took another step closer, her voice dropping lower. What I want is simple, she said, her words steady, almost too calm. I want to understand how someone like you, someone in your position, can act with such reckless disregard. And more importantly, I want to know why I shouldn't report this to my superiors and let them handle it. Marcus's jaw tightened. He didn't need to hear the rest of her sentence to know exactly what she meant. If she reported him, his career would be over. It wasn't just a slap. It was a violation of the trust that he had built over the years. It was a crack in his carefully constructed image of the tough, no-nonsense detective who played by his own rules. Look, Marcus said, his voice tense, but trying to remain calm. I messed up. I was frustrated. You don't know what it's like trying to close a case when the pieces aren't falling into place. I let my emotions get the better of me, but that won't happen again. I promise. Jasmine studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Marcus could feel the weight of her gaze, the silent judgment that hung between them like an invisible force. She wasn't buying it. Not entirely, but there was something in her eyes that made him think she wasn't done with him yet. I'm not here to destroy your career, detective, she said finally, her voice quieter but still firm. But I'm also not here to let you off the hook. I'm watching you. Every move you make from here on out will be under scrutiny. Marcus felt a knot tighten in his chest. He didn't like it. He didn't like being watched, especially not by someone like her. But he knew she wasn't bluffing. Jasmine wasn't playing games. She had the power to tear everything he had worked for apart, and she wasn't afraid to use it. I understand, he said, his voice steady, though he wasn't sure he really did. He didn't like being in this position, feeling vulnerable, feeling like he was on the edge of losing everything. Jasmine took a step back, and for a brief moment, the tension between them seemed to dissipate. She turned to walk away, but then paused. I'll be in touch, she said without looking back. Don't make me regret not reporting you. Marcus watched her walk off, the weight of her words settling heavily on his chest. He had just been handed a second chance, but he didn't know if he could keep it. The days that followed Marcus' encounter with Jasmine Williams felt like a slow suffocation. Every time he walked through the precinct, he felt the eyes of his colleagues on him, as if they knew something had changed, though no one dared ask him directly. He had never been one to shy away from attention, but now it was as if his every move was being watched. The air felt thick with suspicion, and he could feel the weight of it pressing on his shoulders with each passing hour. His case files sat untouched, his phone rang unanswered, and his thoughts constantly returned to Jasmine. She had warned him. She had told him she was watching, but the realization of what that really meant began to sink in. Internal affairs was no small matter. They didn't just investigate corrupt cops or officers who were bending the rules. They were the ones who exposed everything. The dirty secrets, the skeletons in the closet, the small compromises that added up to ruin a career. They were the ones who knew how to dig deep, to find the cracks in a seemingly unblemished career and use them to tear everything down. Marcus had been in the game long enough to know that there were always cracks, no matter how polished the surface looked. He had made deals, cut corners, and looked the other way when it suited him. His career had been built on playing the system, bending the rules just enough to stay ahead of the game. But Jasmine wasn't like the others. She wasn't someone he could manipulate or intimidate into backing down. He knew that now. The first few days after their encounter were filled with an underlying tension, an uncomfortable waiting game. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that Jasmine was just waiting for him to slip up. One wrong move, one mistake, and she would be there, ready to pounce. It wasn't a threat. It was a guarantee. She had no intention of letting him off the hook. It wasn't long before the first sign of trouble appeared. Marcus had been in a meeting with a few of the higher-ups discussing a case that had been growing colder by the day. He was trying to keep his mind on the work, but his attention kept drifting. Every time the door opened, every time someone walked by, he couldn't help but glance toward the hallway, wondering if Jasmine was watching him, waiting for him to make a misstep. Then the door opened again. But this time it wasn't just any officer. It was one of the detectives from Internal Affairs. He didn't know her name, but he recognized the badge. The woman looked around the room and walked directly up to him. "Detective Kane, I need to speak with you," she said, her tone formal, but with an undercurrent of something more unsettling. Marcus felt his stomach twist. "What's this about?" "I'm here on behalf of Internal Affairs," she said, the words hanging in the air like a threat. "We need you to come with me." Every instinct Marcus had screamed at him to refuse, to hold his ground and demand an explanation. But the truth was, he didn't have the luxury of making demands anymore. Not after the way he'd acted, not after Jasmine had made it clear how much power she had. He was already deep in it, and there was no way out now. With a tense nod, he stood up, following the detective down the hallway. The looks from his colleagues were impossible to ignore, the quiet whispers and the sharp glances. It was as if the whole precinct knew something he didn't, and they were all waiting for the final outcome. The walk to Internal Affairs felt like a slow death. Every step he took seemed to drag on longer than the last. When they reached the door to Jasmine's office, Marcus felt his pulse quicken. It wasn't just any office. It was the heart of the department, the place where careers were made and broken. The walls were lined with files, each one containing the potential to ruin someone's life. The detective opened the door and gestured for Marcus to enter. The air inside was cold and sterile, the kind of atmosphere that immediately put you on edge. Jasmine sat behind her desk, her eyes sharp as she looked up at him. Her expression was unreadable, but there was no mistaking the power she held in this room. "Have a seat, detective," she said, her voice calm but firm. Marcus hesitated for only a moment before sitting down across from her. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, as if the walls were closing in around him. He had no idea what she was planning, but he knew it couldn't be good. "We need to discuss your actions," Jasmine said, her gaze never leaving his. "Specifically, your behavior the other day." Marcus nodded, but he didn't speak. He wasn't sure what to say. He had already apologized, but that didn't seem to matter. The slap had already happened. The damage had already been done. "I've been reviewing your file," Jasmine continued, her voice steady, "and I'm afraid it's not just the incident with me that's raising red flags. There are other concerns, other instances where your actions have crossed the line." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just about the slap. This was bigger. Jasmine was digging into his past, into his career. She was looking for anything, any reason to bring him down. "You've made compromises," she said, almost as if she were reading from a script. "You've turned a blind eye to corruption, made deals with people you should have reported. And there's a pattern here, detective. A pattern that shows a willingness to bend the rules, to cross ethical boundaries when it suits you." Marcus opened his mouth to protest, but Jasmine held up a hand, silencing him. "You've built your career on playing the system," she said, her voice low but firm, "and now it's time for you to face the consequences." Her words were like ice, cutting through the fog of his thoughts. He had been careful, hadn't he? He'd always stayed just within the bounds of what could be called acceptable. But Jasmine wasn't interested in what was acceptable. She was interested in truth, and she was determined to expose everything. "I'm giving you a choice, detective," Jasmine said, her eyes narrowing. "You can cooperate, you can come clean, admit your mistakes, and work with me to fix this. Or you can continue down this path, and I'll make sure the entire department knows what you've done." Marcus felt a cold sweat break out across his back. The weight of her words hit him like a ton of bricks. There was no bargaining here. She wasn't offering a way out. She was offering him a chance to save face before it all came crashing down. "I want you to think about what you're going to do, because once this goes public, there's no coming back," she said, standing up. "The choice is yours." As she left the room, Marcus sat there, his mind racing. The walls were closing in, and he didn't know how much longer he could keep the pieces of his life from falling apart. Jasmine had made her move, and now it was his turn. The days following the encounter in Jasmine's office felt like an endless spiral downward for Marcus. Every interaction, every phone call, every step he took within the precinct felt as though he was walking on a razor's edge. He had been given a choice, but it didn't feel like a choice at all. Jasmine had set her terms, clear and unwavering, and now he had to decide how to play this precarious game. For the first time in his career, Marcus felt like he was out of his depth. His reputation had always been his armor. His ability to manipulate situations, to bend the rules without ever breaking them, had kept him untouchable. But Jasmine had seen through it all. She had not only exposed his weaknesses, but had also given him a choice that felt more like a trap than an opportunity. The prospect of going public with his misdeeds was chilling. He had always been careful, always managed to cover his tracks, but Jasmine wasn't playing by the same rules. She wasn't interested in keeping things quiet or letting him slip by. If she followed through on her threats, his career, everything he had worked for would be gone in an instant. Marcus spent the following nights alone in his apartment, mulling over his options. He could come clean, admit his mistakes, and hope for some mercy from Jasmine. But that was risky. If he cooperated, it was likely she would dig even deeper into his past, unearthing everything he had carefully hidden for years. The thought of facing the fallout from all those buried secrets made his stomach turn. On the other hand, if he refused to cooperate, he knew Jasmine wouldn't hesitate to tear him apart. She had the power. She had the evidence. She had already shown that she was willing to go after him, and he had no reason to believe she would stop. But could he really trust her? Would admitting everything to her ensure some kind of leniency, or would it just be the beginning of a downward spiral from which he could never recover? It was a game of survival, and Marcus was beginning to understand that he wasn't the one who held the cards anymore. The next morning, Marcus walked into the precinct with a heavy heart. He had made up his mind. He would cooperate with Jasmine, at least for now. He didn't trust her completely, but he was willing to take the risk. The longer he delayed, the more likely it was that internal affairs would find something else to hang over his head. The idea of fighting back and trying to keep his secrets intact was too dangerous. As he walked through the halls, his colleagues gave him sidelong glances, their whispers like a distant hum in his ears. He ignored them, focusing instead on the path ahead. He had a meeting with Jasmine scheduled later that day. His stomach twisted with nerves as he approached her office, but he didn't stop. He had made his decision. Jasmine was waiting for him when he arrived, sitting behind her desk, her posture straight, her gaze fixed on him as though she had been expecting him all along. She didn't speak at first, letting the silence stretch between them, as though weighing his very presence. Finally, she spoke. "I'm glad you've decided to cooperate," she said, her voice calm but sharp, like the edge of a blade. "I wasn't sure if you'd come around, but I'll give you credit for making the right decision." Marcus couldn't tell if she was being sincere or simply playing the game. It didn't matter. He wasn't here for small talk. "I've made mistakes," he said, his voice steady, though there was an edge of uncertainty beneath the words. "I've done things I'm not proud of. But I want to fix this. I want to make it right." Jasmine's eyes never left his face. Making it right isn't always as easy as saying the words, detective, but we'll start with the truth. All of it. Marcus swallowed hard. This was it. There was no turning back now. "What do you want to know?" he asked, his voice thick with the weight of what was about to happen. Jasmine leaned forward slightly, folding her hands on the desk in front of her. "I want the whole story, every detail. Don't leave anything out." And so he began. He told her about the deals he had made, the times he had turned a blind eye, the moments when he had let his ambition cloud his judgment. He told her about the cases where he had used his position to his advantage, where he had looked the other way for the sake of a promotion or a bribe. He confessed to everything, everything he could remember, at least. Jasmine listened intently, not once interrupting him. There was no judgment in her eyes, no reaction at all, but Marcus could feel the weight of her scrutiny pressing down on him with every word. He had never been this vulnerable before, never been forced to expose the parts of himself that he had spent years hiding from everyone, even from himself. It felt like a slow unraveling, like a dam that was finally breaking after years of holding back the flood. When he was finished, the room fell into silence. Jasmine didn't speak right away. Instead, she simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. Marcus could feel the tension building in the air, his chest tightening as he waited for her response. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm but stern. "You've made a lot of mistakes, detective. You've betrayed the very values you were supposed to uphold. But that doesn't mean you're beyond saving. You've got two choices now. One, you can continue cooperating, and I'll do my best to help you navigate the consequences. Or two, you can turn your back on this, and I'll expose everything you've just told me, without hesitation." Marcus's heart raced as he processed her words. It was the same ultimatum, but now it felt more real. The consequences of his decision felt heavier than ever before. He knew that whatever path he chose, there would be no escaping the aftermath. "I'll cooperate," Marcus said, his voice steady, though the words felt like they were being torn from him. "I'll do whatever it takes." Jasmine nodded, her expression softening just slightly. "Good. You've made the right choice, but understand this, detective. There is no going back now. From here on out, your every move will be under scrutiny. If you slip, if you lie, if you try to cover anything up, I will expose you. I'm not going to let you off easy. But if you're willing to face the consequences, we'll work together to make sure you don't end up with nothing." Marcus nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and dread wash over him. He had chosen his path, but the journey ahead would be anything but easy. There were no guarantees, there were no second chances, and as much as he wanted to believe that cooperating would lead to redemption, deep down, he knew that this was a game he could very well lose.